You've referred to these pieces as a pilgrimage. Could you explain that?
Well, so in a way that the idea to start with was, how could I get to play these pieces a lot? So very pragmatically, I sort of thought about how I could, engineer that. And then when I started playing them, of course, I had played them as a student, not all of them, but most of them as a student. I'd studied and learnt in that place from being sort of an 18-year-old to a 22, 23-year-old. But largely since then, I'd completely left them alone. So when I sort of returned to them, the one thing that I knew I had to do if I was going to really get inside them was simply play them a great deal. They're pretty difficult. First of all, if you're going to play them from memory, you want to get to a place where that ceases to be an issue. And there's a lot of notes, and there are a lot of notes in the same key very often. The B minor partita, for instance, it's 8 movements, 5 of which are completely without harmony, moving through similar modulations in the same key. So in order to find your way through that piece reliably in a way that you're not thinking about, my goodness, what's coming up next? Am I going to remember it? That took a little while, and I sort of knew it would. But just to get back, so my idea was that they worked best in church or in places of spiritual reverberation, just because of the way in which they had been conceived and the circumstances in which they've been written. This is definitely music pointed towards the infinite and questions about life and death. So churches seemed like a good place to start. And so I just wrote around to lots of friends and said, I'm going to set aside 2 months of the summer, May and June that year. Have you got any ideas about where I might play these pieces? If I could dedicate the concert to a charity, every church, as I know from where I live, is often struggling to find funds to mend a leaky roof or to have a window done or new doors or this or that funding thing. So there was a nice tie-up there, and actually what happened was that many, many people got in touch, and it kind of snowballed nicely. And I had sort of put a mental block on the idea. I thought, 50 concerts would be sort of too much to hope for, but actually I got 50 concerts, and I probably could have played, got a few more, but 50 was plenty. And about a week, 2 weeks into it, I got into a place where, I wasn't obsessing about forgetting or memorizing. I would just pitch up at a place, meet a few very charming people, be left alone in a church building to play, and then do a concert that evening. And nothing could have been more wonderfully sort of straightforward and uncomplicated. I was literally driving myself somewhere, playing music and sleeping and eating, and that was it.
I think the way you're talking about that approach to playing, to kind of not be watching yourself in a way, is also what we try to achieve in the studio. And in a way, I saw my job as a very simple one, and that was to give Tom permission for him to feel safe to do the unsafe thing, so that he can walk a tightrope without a safety net, and know that he'll be caught, or maybe he might even discover that he can fly. And implicitly, and even maybe sometimes explicitly, I could say to Tom, you can play it badly if you want. You can forget about wrong notes or right notes. You can forget about what your best friend is going to say, or your colleagues, or a critic. Just forget it all.
Yes. And even what was in my mind, what I was hoping to achieve. Because actually in every session, and we spent a day on each piece, so we had a long time. So I knew that if I played it through a couple of times with a break, that there would be plenty of time to go away and come back. And I must say, I know that usually, I mean, you know better than this because you listen to everything, that very rarely were my initial thoughts on where I was trying to go the good ones. I mean, usually I was discovering new things as if by accident, or they were occurring to me, and I felt, thanks to Stephen being as non-invasive as he was, that I could just go there. And there was always time enough. There was, energy, time to relax, time to come away. And also I made a point. I mean, I don't know whether you wanted me not to do this, but I certainly didn't want to spend a lot of time going back and listening to what I'd done. I have a feeling that's... I mean, there are times in the recording process, I've been on so many recordings in so many different atmospheres, so many different procedures when there's been too much time and very rarely when there's been not enough time, usually, which means you have to kind of agree to some frame, some process. And usually the disappointing thing about that is I've noticed that when people listen back to what they've just done, it immediately sets a frame and the ceiling becomes trying to possibly make that clean and tidy. So there isn't much room, much time often, for very understandable reasons when you've got say a big orchestra or even just 4 or 5 people. And people's metabolic rates are different, but we could completely go by what I was feeling at the time, and if I wanted to stop, I could just stop, take a break. And if I suddenly thought, now's the moment to plunge into a complete reading of whichever piece it was, then that was the right time. And so I think our approach was unusual and possibly, commercially speaking, unrepeatable. But I think it produced some very good things. I've also noticed that working with you was the very opposite to... Often the producer-artist relationship is a very complex one, and often the artist sort of wants the producer to almost take the place of a teacher kind of role. And sometimes I think that's a slightly dangerous place, especially for people who've been educated in classical music, which so much of which can seem like curbing or minimizing or kind of making neater and smaller one's essential self. So instead of saying expanding into something and simply throwing oneself into it, it becomes, that's often characterized as being a very dangerous thing to do. So what one must do is kind of squeeze into something. And, well, you don't like me doing that because I think you think that I do my best things when I'm untethered and
I think everybody does.
Well, everybody does, but it's interesting that a lot of artists, I think, almost don't want that because it becomes very quickly quite dangerous feeling.
Yes, it's
because
quite scary.
There are no boundaries. So, I suppose because we had the time, and it's just me, a single violinist standing out there, we could go fairly easily on that sort of path. But it is an interesting, unplottable sort of place to get to, and I know that really interested me. So yes, I made a decision not to go and listen to anything. I think really I didn't listen to anything after a little bit of the sound right at the beginning.
Yes, it was just to sort of approve the sound.
And even then I wasn't really happy with it, and I just put it out of my mind and just thought, I'm in the hands of terrific people. I'm just going to leave it and play. Yeah.